So Kristal, project lead of Youth Capital, thank you very much for joining us on SMWX to discuss the Youth Capital Shift 2021 Unlocking Jobs report.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Sizwe.
The pleasure is mine, and that's because I've been watching Youth Capital and the work that you've been doing for a while. It seems very exciting, dynamic, something to spark a bit of hope in an otherwise barren situation of hope in our country. So before we get started, just take us through the inspiration for founding and creating this organization and really what it is that you are seeking to do with Youth Capital.
Sure. So we've been around since the beginning of 2018, so still relatively new as an organization, but we're an incubator project of the DG Murray Trust, which is a public benefit organization that's been around for a number of decades already. And the trust really created Youth Capital to fulfill two gaps that they identified in addressing the crisis of youth unemployment. And the first gap is that young people's lived experiences and their stories and their voices were really missing from our approaches to tackling the problem. And I think even currently, if you look at a lot of the big government initiatives, it's all quite top-down, big corporate involvement, but we are young voices in that space of solution creation. And then secondly, that we were lacking a shared and common agenda for youth unemployment. My background's actually in public health, and so I worked in the HIV public health space before. And if I look at that, there were always quite clear targets that everybody was working towards. And I think that gives direction to the various stakeholders, whether you're a grassroots organization or a massive global funder, to have a clear agenda is really important. And so those were really the key tenets around which Youth Capital was created. And so we spent a lot, spent a lot of time in 2018 and 2019. I was a team of one for quite a while. So traveling the country, speaking to young people, and trying to understand what their experiences were in their journey from education through to employment or sustainable livelihood. And at the same time, doing desktop research, looking at what was existing in the space and the research that was there, and looking at it through a different lens, through the lens given to me by interacting with these young people. And through all of that, we came up with our action plan, which we launched in Shift 2020, where we addressed the 10 key systemic challenges that we think we need to overcome if we're really going to tackle the youth unemployment crisis.
Yeah, it's great to have an organization like that around. Those of us who write about big structural problems are always asked, where are the short-term solutions? So now I just point people to Youth Capital to find those.
We've got some big ones and some small ones, but it's not easy.
Indeed. So Kristal, before we dive into some of the details of this report, which is really a look at how we can unlock youth unemployment and a raft of fascinating and new solutions to this crisis and scourge, I wanted to take a step back and ask you if there was one thing in this report that surprised you or that taught you something that you didn't know before you had actually undergone the process of creating and curating this report.
Yes, I think what we started out with was to look at the effects of lockdown, because we couldn't put out a report in 2021 and not talk to the effects of the pandemic. It's in all the headlines. We keep hearing about it. And so I think what was interesting for me is we had an analyst look at the National Income Dynamics Survey, so NIDS, which has been going for years. And then they also had NIDS CRAM, which is the particular survey that they ran sort of every 3 or 4 months from hard lockdown up until, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
And when we compare the youth unemployment rates across these different studies, and what's interesting about the studies, it goes back to the same people so far as possible each time. We see that the numbers were continuing to rise anyway. And so for me, the argument that unemployment is so bad because of lockdown. Yes, lockdown has definitely had an effect, and particularly on young Black women. It's had a huge effect across a range of spheres, including employment. I think it's important to realize that even without lockdown, we would still sit with a huge and insurmountable number of young people who are locked out of any kind of educational employment opportunities. And I think for me, that was, a surprising and quite scary and shocking finding, actually.
That is kind of terrifying. I guess we just assumed that things would click back into place when we got back from lockdown, but it seems like this problem is stickier than we even first imagined.
Absolutely. And I think important to contextualize it globally. Everybody's struggling with youth unemployment. Actually, it's becoming a growing challenge in places where it perhaps wasn't such a big challenge before, whereas in South Africa, it's always been a challenge. And so I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in our case.
Well, the report really focuses on three key areas, which you think are crucial to solving and resolving, or at least addressing, this crisis of youth unemployment. And I want to start with the first theme, which is this idea of certification. And an interesting idea, because one wouldn't immediately think, well, we need to certify people more in order to create or enable youth employment. So take us through why you think certifying young people is so important, and some of the suggestions you have around certification in the certify us part of the report.
Sure. So, in talking to young people, things around issues of certification came up a lot and continue to come up. The difficulty that young people without a matric face, they're really at the bottom of the barrel in terms of an employer choosing somebody, even for really entry-level jobs. So you think about a packer at your local ShopRite or Checkers, because there's so many unemployed young people to choose from, employers can be picky. And without a matric certificate, you really don't stand a chance. Through to young people who have worked for years to get their qualifications only to not have access to the certificate because of historical debt. And I know historical debt has come up a lot recently, but when I first started this in 2018, it wasn't quite as topical. And I'm glad that it's on the radar, and some universities and technical universities are moving away from that, which is great. And then also what doesn't get spoken about a lot, and what we speak about in the report, is the work-based place learning element. So, young people that go through the technical and vocational training route, but need that practical experience to convert their qualification into a degree from a diploma. They go for years without ever getting that work-based place experience. So they've done the work. And then they just can't get the right practical experience that connects with what they've studied, either because, the college hasn't helped them, or because they don't understand, or just because there aren't employers willing to take them on. And we really think these are actually small hurdles to overcome. There's solutions that exist to overcome these certification issues. We just need to lower the barriers to entry for young people.
So frustrating to realize that pieces of paper are actually in many ways stifling and preventing us from solving a problem that everyone recognizes is a huge crisis. The historical debt thing really stood out for me, with students who, again, they've actually done the work, they've passed. Some of them have excelled, and just being able to get a piece of paper which says that they have actually excelled becomes this huge financial barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we know that young people struggle with signaling their skills to employers. So, I've just gone through a recruitment process, and sometimes I look at CVs and, I want to help every young person that applies and just say, if you just did this on your CV, you would have such a stronger application. And so when young people already struggle to know how to signal their skills, these pieces of paper really are so valuable in saying to an employer, these are the skills I have. And that's why they are so important when it comes to, just improving the chances of finding a job.
The second pillar of the report focuses on reducing the cost of seeking a job. Really interesting statistics that you cite of, it costing nearly 1,000 Rand to even look for a job. And one worries what the pay is after, even if you're one of the lucky people to be successful. Again, take us through why you thought that this idea of reducing the cost of seeking a job is an important part of this broader picture of tackling youth unemployment?
Well, when we talk to young people and we say, young people that have given up looking for work, or young people that say, it's important to understand the reasons why they've given up. You might speak to them today and they've given up. 2 months from now, they're looking every single day of the week, and people will be like, what changed? A lot of the time, what changed is access to money, financial resources to look for work, because looking for work costs money. A lot of applications require printed CVs, which is archaic in my opinion. Expect young people to have police clearance or certified copies of things. That requires photocopying money, transport money to and from the police station, and then also just to get to the interview. So, young people are spending hundreds of rands to go and look for work. And now in COVID, where things have moved online, we see a shift. So we actually have a report coming out shortly. We've been running a survey with Open Dialogue around the cost of job seeking to get an updated figure, because the one in the report is a few years old, pre-COVID.
Sure.
And we're starting to see shifts that the cost now is all on data, which you can understand because we're all meeting on Zoom. So, this really gets in the way for young people. And I think what excites me about this particular section of the publication is that, it's a lot of the solutions are big government solutions, big institutional solutions. But here we speak to some solutions that smaller organizations have quickly implemented as a response to COVID, but which we think are, real small shifts that are scalable, that you don't need to be a massive government organization to implement. And so I think, we're really excited about some of the solutions that we put forward there.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was reading and thinking through the report, I almost got like a picture of the journey of trying to get a job, and just how many hoops you have to jump through, whether that's like starting from just an ID document and then a certified copy of that ID, and then all the costs associated with data and seeking, and then the travel. And at each step of that way, it almost feels like we're putting up obstacles rather than bringing them down.
Exactly. And, I always say to people, and some people are shocked by this, but I often say, if we waved a magic wand tomorrow and created 9 million opportunities for all the 9 million youth who are not in employment, education, or training, they still wouldn't be able to successfully take up those opportunities and make a success of them. And I'm not saying that because young people aren't driven or resilient or hardworking. That's not what I mean. I mean, we haven't given them the tools to make successes, even if we gave them those opportunities. And I think that's what we try to do across the full 10 points, is to say that, we have to look at a young person as a human being living in a world with multiple things affecting them and acting on their lives. And until we look at that full journey and address the full journey, these piecemeal interventions that only address one step are always going to fail, or always going to, only help a few in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting interventions in this section of the report, which again deals with reducing the cost of job seeking, is you look at a number of case studies where you've looked at how initiatives which try to make use of WhatsApp or reducing the cost of data have succeeded in bringing those barriers down somewhat. Take us through some of the things that you've seen that have actually worked, which if we scale them could reap dividends.
Yeah, and I think what's important to mention here, and why the case studies are so important for us at Youth Capital, is because we're a team of 4. Okay, we don't have any grand desire to assume that we can solve all 10 points on our own, and nobody can. Government can't either. And it's really going to take a coordinated effort. And that's what I really like about this section, is it shows you've got the big government intervention, which is the sayouth.mobi site, which is, partnered between government and Arambi. But then we have organizations like Minto and the Zano Network, which are small organizations. Some of them are only in one province, but they've come up with solutions using WhatsApp bots. And this excites me because it's meeting young people people where they are. It's not asking them to download another app, to navigate a website, which, young people are, some of them have entry-level smartphones that have space for 100 apps on their phone. Young people don't navigate websites. Who goes to websites? We use apps. So, WhatsApp data bundles are by far the most affordable data option. So this is a solution that says, this is where young people are. This is the technology. They already know how to navigate. Let's use it to make job seeking more affordable, to help them create CVs, to do automated using an AI bot to get first round interviews out of the way, to save them transport costs, where 100 of them pitch for an interview, but there's only 20 places, and to, make it easy. And on the employer side, you would have spent ages interviewing all of those people in person. So, going through the WhatsApp answers are actually probably a more efficient use of your time. So it's a win-win for both sides. And I think that really excites me, the fact that small organizations could pull this off in lockdown as a response to the situation shows that it is actually an easy solution compared to some of the other things, and can be done from big organizations all the way through to smaller ones.
Well, Kristal, thanks so much for taking us through the first two parts. I want to move to the third part of the report now. And here you quite interestingly focus on public employment. I think we often put the burden on the private space and the private sphere to create this employment. But you focus on the public sector and how it can be a driver for youth employment. Take us through your survey of some of the initiatives that already exist and what we can be doing more to harness the power and the scale of the public sector.
Sure. So, public works programs have existed for a long time through expanded public works programs and community works programs. But, lately, and especially now as a response to the COVID pandemic, there's been a real push to say this is where government's really going to put its money and its energies in terms of tackling the youth unemployment crisis. And so we saw, the biggest amount of money that's ever gone to a public works program in the form of the Basic Education Employment Initiative, which is part of the presidential stimulus package. And phase one ran from December of last year to April of this year. And we ran a survey where we asked young people who had been part of the program and were hired as assistants to complete the survey looking at their experience, but we also asked school management teams to respond and say what was their experience of having these young people. And I think no surprise to anyone is that, majority of schools are under-resourced, so having extra hands on deck is a welcome relief, and they were all really sad that it was a short-term contract and that these young people then left and they were back to, being overstretched. But from young people themselves, I think the takeaways for us is, even if we're going to have these public works programs, which are short-term because we can't expect our government to, have millions of opportunities going all the time. There's no budget for that. So realistically, they have to be short-term. But we're saying, to think about when, ideally, 6 months to a year, so that young people can really learn a skill when they're in their short-term employment contracts. If we look at other programs that, NGOs that have done it through different funding sources, it takes at least 6 months. And if you think about your own experience, it probably takes you at least 6 months when you get to a new job to really figure out what's going on.
6 years, I was going to say.
Yeah, I know, we're still learning, right? But, at least 6 months for young people to really understand what's going on, especially in a school environment where there are long holidays and breaks and exams. So, to say that that's really important. And the other thing is mentorship on the job. So, particularly in a schooling environment, teachers are busy, they might not have the capacity. And so it's really important when placing these young people that there is a teacher that is briefed, that understands that the whole purpose of these public employment programs is to give young people without work experience a taste of what it's like to be in the workplace, so that it makes them more employable and more likely to succeed in their next opportunity. And if we don't give mentorship, if we don't give some kind of transferable skills in these opportunities, then they really are wasted. A young person has some money in their pocket for a couple of months, which is great, but it doesn't translate into experience that can help them access a next opportunity. And that's really what the magic of these public employment programs should be, given that they're short term.
Well, thanks so much for giving us this report, for working on it, and for producing it. I would encourage everyone watching to go out and get a copy of the report, go on to Youth Capital's. Do you have a website? I know now that you've disparaged websites, but I'm sure you can find it on social media.
We do, but we are on social media as well. Youth Capital SA.
I'll also I'll add a link to it below. I wanted to ask you in closing, though, not to put you on the spot or anything, but there's been an interesting debate of late about the value of employment versus the value of just giving money to people effectively, or at least providing people with an income. These debates about a universal basic income. Where do you stand on that? And do you think that these kinds of initiatives where we supplement people's incomes can be an addition to this, or do you think that it would be harmful overall?
I think if we look at experience from other cash transfer, it's a cash transfer mechanism essentially is what we're talking about. And so if we look at other situations, for example, my background in public health, we've seen the impact that cash transfers to young girls can have in reducing HIV transmission, right? And so I think money is power. We all know that, right? We can speak about, many other things and not making money the center, but we all have to eat, we all have to live, we all want to clothe our children and send them to school and give them a better future than we have. So you need money to do those things. And then secondly, when you particularly look at the economic situation in South Africa, we can't get the economy to grow if people don't have money to spend in the economy. And I keep making this argument to corporates and business people, to say, if we don't invest in this generation of young people now, who are going to be your customers 10, 20 years from now? Because if we never get these young people employed, they're not going to have money to spend to buy your product or to use your service. So I think, it's important to think about these cash transfers not as a handout, but exactly that. It's, stimulating a circulation of capital into the economy. And as I said, especially for young job seekers, this could really unlock opportunities for them. And if you think about the young female job seekers who are often hindered by the cost of childcare, trying to find a babysitter and the choices they have to make between looking after their children or going to look for work, I think this kind of basic universal income grant could be a huge unlocker of potential. And I would argue that if government can't roll it out to everybody, that we should at least start with the most vulnerable, which would be, young Black women, young job seekers, because I think it would allow them to go and find work with greater incomes, which would, stimulate the economy. And in the long term, we'd really reap a lot of reward from that investment.
Kristal Duncan-Williams, thank you very much for joining us on SMWX.
Thanks so much for having me, Sizwe.